my screen. All right, y'all can see the PowerPoint right now?
Yep, you're good.
All right, good. And why is it not loading? There we go. All right, welcome back. I'm just gonna move my videos here, or my video feeds here. Welcome back, everyone. This is our, what is it? Our 5th? Is it our 6th meeting? I can't remember after this point. Anyway, here's just a few housekeeping rules as always. Right now, we do require 12 hours and at least 6 out of the 7 meetings for our members to attend in order to be considered active. However, that might be subject to change as I got to talking with Dr. Harper, and we might have to change our requirements in order to laxen it up because it's a little difficult for some people. Turns out a lot of people to show up to these meetings. So we'll just think about that. And we will have officer elections and new member induction at our next meeting. So look forward to that and hopefully see a couple of fresh new faces. All right. Move on to the next one. All right, and as always, we will have trivia night in the spring semester. So that won't be the next meeting, but it'll be the meeting after next, and that'll be held completely over Zoom, and it'll be through Kahoot. So everyone will be able to enjoy and also socially distance. It'll be a whole lot of fun. We'll have several different categories ranging from stuff like pop culture, and then we can have some science where we can dunk on the guests that we bring over. But anyone is free to attend. You can even invite friends. You can just put that on like your class group me, whatever class it is. I don't care as long as you share it with people. That's a-okay with me. And again, that's on the 22nd. So not next meeting, but the meeting after next. And so if you're running short on hours this semester, obviously you can attend meetings. You could attend trivia night. That's going to be a lot of hours. We'll count that as, I believe we settled on 3 hours. Maybe it was 2, I can't remember. I'll talk with our officers afterwards. But we also have some tutoring that typically occurs every Friday, unless we are going to be at the field station that week on the Friday afternoon, then we'll always have it from 2 to 3 in the afternoon. We also have our Southern Central Regional Convention for TriBeta. That'll be on April 10th. You will have to register and pay a fee of $25, but essentially you can get all of your hours in this one go. And so it's a lot of hours. It's really interesting stuff. You get to hear a lot of papers and research being presented. It's really cool stuff. In addition, we also have all the other volunteering options on the side. And I really recommend just doing trash pickup one. It's easy. Help beautify Huntsville and maybe save a few turtles in the long run. All right, and if you miss meetings, you can obviously go onto YouTube and type in Delta Tau chapter TriBeta, and you'll find our channels. And I think we have 3 meetings up there right now, soon to be 4 after this one. And if you also want to hear Dr. Bocelli, you can ask any of the officers, and then we can hook you up with a video for your viewing pleasure. Alrighty, and so this week's speaker is Dr. Amber Ulseth, and she'll be talking with us about her research on streams and carbon cycling. And now if I can end my sharing, stop sharing. All right, it's all you, Dr. Ulseth.
All right, so I guess I'll just share my screen here. Let's see here. Of course, it's my whole, we'll just make this big. The computer's really slow today, so hopefully this is, no, the death spin right now. Let's see. There we go. All right, so yeah, so mostly I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of my path through sort of researching carbon cycling and stream ecosystems. And so some of the stuff I put together is what I'm going to try to go through with you today. Sort of will take us through work here in Texas, work I did in Europe and Austria and also in Switzerland, and sort of trying to put a picture together as to why we want to study carbon cycling in streams and sort of what we know, and hopefully end in with maybe the direction I know I'm trying to go here now that I'm at SAM. And so that's sort of a little bit of an outline. So, basically why on earth am I talking about carbon to you for like 45 minutes? And so also the big two take home points that I'm going to try to get to today is talk about the origin of carbon in streams. That is, where does carbon come from? And then a big factor is what drives the evasion of carbon dioxide from streams. And this will make sense a lot more when I get into why we study carbon in streams, as to why I might focus on carbon dioxide. And so this is, for example, this is one of my former field sites in Switzerland here, in the Valais region of Switzerland. And one thing that will come up quite often throughout this talk, and the different components I'm going to talk about, is something that I never thought I would work a lot on, and that is gas exchange. And I really didn't want, but the thing is, gas exchange drives a lot of what I do, from modeling ecosystem metabolism to also estimating fluxes of gas. And so basically, what gas exchange is this is just a simple depiction. This is, for instance, the layer of water. You have the air, we have the water, and we really need to understand how gases move across this. Gases are dissolved in water, and then how they move into the atmosphere and vice versa. And by far, this definitely comes into play in a lot of different calculations and a lot of our estimates of the fluxes of carbon that we're trying to understand across the globe. And arguably, I'm focused on streams and rivers, but this is the case also for lakes and rivers, and then also marine ecosystems as well. So besides the fact that all life on Earth is based on carbon, you might be like, why on earth do we study carbon, right? A really major reason why we study carbon, of course, is the current climate change, right, that we're undergoing right now. This is data from Scripps, the Mauna Loa record that has, they have records going back continuously from 1958. That's this thicker line right here, and those little changes are actually seasonal changes that we see. And then we can also use ice core data to get back further into time. And the main take home of this data, so this is looking at around 1700 into today. So I just downloaded this data when I started prepping for this lecture on, so as of March 17th, our latest CO2 reading was 460 ppm. And so this is extremely high, like, so when I was like in college, right, it was down here, right? So we've increased quite a bit in the last decades. And this is of course concern because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. And so the more carbon dioxide we have in our atmosphere, the warmer our climate will tend to be. We can also go into climate change and talk about that more. A lot of times we call it global weirding, right? And that's because we're going to see lots of fluctuations in climate across the globe. And this is definitely driven to this anthropogenic increase in CO2 from burning of fossil fuels. So that's really what's driving the big picture research of what I'm focusing on. And so in 2007, this is about the time I started my PhD, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is really I would say the authority on climate change. It's an international consortium of scientists that put the data together and try to understand the state of science in terms of climate change. But basically, as of 2007, this is sort of looking at a global budget. All those numbers, we won't get in the nitty gritty of all these numbers, but basically we can quantify how much carbon is, where it is, and where the fluxes are going. So all the arrows are carbon moves from one pool to the next pool. And of course, in streams and rivers, that's what's depicted here. It was estimated that, yeah, we get carbon coming off from rocks. Rocks can dissolve when you run water over them. So that what we call weathering. We can get dissolved inorganic carbon, and also then, of course, forming to CO2. Also weathering processes coming from the atmosphere. Also, of course, we have carbon coming in from the terrestrial landscape, from the forests, from the soils. That carbon hits the river, goes through the river ecosystems, all the rivers, and then hits the ocean. And so this is sort of this earlier carbon budget just considered rivers as a pipe, basically. And so looking at that model, we can sort of look at all the different rivers across the globe. This is one of my favorite figures from the National Geographic, which is like the Bible of my family growing up. And so what to note here is that all the fresh water on Earth is 3% of all the global water. Of course, oceans constitute most of that. Frozen locks up a lot of our fresh water, as is about 30% underground. And our lakes and rivers are arguably less than 1% of our fresh water. And then also arguably, you can see that rivers and streams and lakes make up relatively a small component of the terrestrial land, right? And so that is that reason why those earlier global climate budgets or carbon budgets considered freshwater ecosystems as pipes. We have carbon coming off the land, it goes into these piped network, and it comes out the ocean the same amount, right? And this is all in pentagrams of carbon per year. However, as a stream ecologist, right, I've been doing this for a number of years, as a number of my colleagues and people I look up to, mentors, right? And so we know that streams and rivers are not merely pipes, but rather there's a lot of processing on the physical, chemical, and even biological end along a stream corridor, right? And so this is some of the seminal sort of model that we think about ecosystems. This is the river continuum concept from 1980, where we can sort of predict the changes from upstream to downstream based on the closeness to the terrestrial landscape, and then also this processing going within the stream. So streams are very much connected from upstream to downstream, and they're also really connected laterally as well, right? And so we have a lot of connection with the terrestrial landscape, also with groundwater. And so this is what this hypereic zone is. So there's a lot of vertical exchange with the stream water within also the sediments right below the stream reach as well. So we know there's lots of exchange, lots of processing that happens, and that they are not pipes. And so a seminal paper by John Cole and colleagues in 2007 came out, published in the journal Ecosystems. And this is really one of the first papers, and really the first paper to quantify the amount of carbon fluxes in freshwater ecosystems on how, in the context of the global carbon budget, right? So this is our old budget. Carbon comes in from the land, goes through the pipe, and comes out at the ocean. And what they were able to quantify in this early budgets is like, wait a minute, it's not just piped, right? Some of that carbon gets stored, right? Especially in lakes or floodplains, right? But then a lot of that carbon also gets lost from the stream ecosystems because of carbon dioxide evasion, right? And so what they're able to do is sort of figure out and quantify amount of carbon that's evaded, the amount of carbon that's stored, and then we're pretty good at measuring the amount of carbon reaching the ocean, arguably. So I'm going to show you a lot of iterations of this, and this number very rarely changes. But then it's a mass budget approach. We add these numbers up, and then now we can quantify, like, wait a minute, we have way more carbon coming off the land than we estimated before, almost double. All right, so this was is really driving a lot of research that we see today, and really driving a lot of the research we've seen the last decade. And so that was that Cole et al. 2007 paper. Tom Batan, who I worked for a number of years in Switzerland, he came out with two papers, 2008, 2009. Lars Tramvik also included reservoirs and lakes. So we started to grow our understanding of this budget throughout the time. And basically, we looked at the export of carbon, the amount of carbon that's stored, and the amount that's fixed because of photosynthesis, right? Photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide, so that's a sink for carbon dioxide. And so you'll see these numbers don't change a lot. They change a little bit. But this number here, this is the amount of CO2 that's being evaded. That's the number that's changed the most. And so starting in 2007, we started regularly having these iterations of understanding this carbon budget up here. And so then in 2013, this is a really big deal in my field, right? Giant, very exciting, is that the IPCC then started to include freshwater ecosystems into the global carbon budget. And so this is the first year, and they stuck with these numbers here, that 0.2 pentagrams of carbon is stored, 1.0 pentagrams of carbon is lost to evasion, and that equated then to that we had about 2.1 pentagrams of carbon coming from the landscape. So this was huge. This is really huge that we now are included within the global carbon budget. But the iterations and the ongoing refinement did not stop there. It's continued to move on. So these are all the number of sort of papers that have come up, different ways that we've learned how to estimate things, such as gas exchange. That's what I talked about at the very beginning of the seminar. We now have more data from the continent of Africa, such as like the Congo River. We now have included small ponds, which are kind of ignored by a lot of people. And then also a little bit understanding even of the carbon dioxide coming out the Amazon River. And so one thing to note here is that these other sort of pools of our carbon isn't changed so much, but the amount of CO2 that we've estimated invading from these freshwaters is just going up and up and up. And so why that is so crucial is that that is how we estimate the carbon coming from the land, right? And carbon coming from the land and carbon locked up in land is very important in terms of carbon budget and mitigating for climate change. And so our failure to include this flux of CO2 coming from surface waters means that we may overestimate or underestimate the carbon coming from the land. So this is really sort of the big picture of what drives my research in trying to understand how carbon is transformed in rivers. And so that's sort of these sort of two big questions we're trying to get at is number one, where does the carbon dioxide evading from streams and rivers come from? And then also, of course, what drives the evasion of carbon dioxide? And so this is sort of the last numbers that I've been able to find lately that were, based on these iterations. So we're up to 5.1 pentagrams of carbon coming from the land, 3.9 pentagrams coming from CO2 evasion. And just to give you an idea why this is at the global scale, this is on par with the amount of carbon moving around the terrestrial ecosystem and also the marine ecosystem as well, right? So these are very small surface area in terms of the global surface area, these streams and rivers and lakes, but they do contribute quite a big punch to the global budget. So we'll start with the first question. And so of course, some of you also just to kind of, so people have a good understanding, streams and rivers, we know that we get carbon coming from external sources, or we also call that allochthonous organic matter or allochthonous carbon. That means carbon that's coming from the terrestrial landscape, for instance, and that's then transported into the stream and river. And then we also have internal sources, which we also call autochthonous sources. And so that's carbon that's created within the stream ecosystem. And so our examples of external sources, that is from terrestrial sources, of course, we can have carbon dioxide. We can also have particulate organic carbon, or we call that POC, and then dissolved organic carbon, DOC. And so if you guys like coffee or tea, you like dissolved organic carbon, right? That's basically what you're drinking, okay? Particulates is the stuff that doesn't go through the filter. It stays on top of the filter when we filter water. And we know that the amount of internal versus external sources of carbon vary along our continuum. From small headwater streams, we tend to have a lot more terrestrial organic matter input. We get to mid-order streams, our streams get wider, we get more sun, we get more primary production within the stream. So then we tend to have more internal inputs. And then as we get to larger streams, a lot of other things are going on as well. And then we get a lot more transport. And so just to give you some examples of research that I've been involved with where we've sort of starting to quantify these in sources of carbon coming into the streams. This is work by Oza Horgby. Oza was a graduate student that I worked with at EPFL in Switzerland. This is one of her first dissertation chapters that she published, where we did a lot of fine scale sampling in a Swiss catchment called Val de Nantes. And there she did a great job. She was able to quantify the amount of groundwater along the reach. So this is going from upstream to downstream, and then looking at the amount of carbon dioxide as well. And so one thing that we were able to note here is that the more groundwater that we had, the more carbon dioxide that we had in the stream. And one reason that is that carbon dioxide is probably coming from weathering of rocks, but then it's also going to be carrying carbon dioxide from soil respiration as well, and terrestrial respiration. And so what happens that hits the stream, you can think of streams as sort of like popping open the champagne cork, right? So all of a sudden you release that pressure, especially in these mountain streams. And then a lot of times that CO2 is degassed immediately and then up into the atmosphere. Also, of course, another source of carbon that we get is that we want to quantify when we're talking about carbon cycling in streams of rivers is the dissolved organic carbon. That's part that you like in your tea or coffee. And so this is some recent work that I've been working on here since I came to SAM, since I have a National Science Foundation grant where I work with a number of collaborators in Corpus Christi. And part of the work that I'm looking at there is looking at the dissolved organic carbon concentrations across 9 sites across this gradient in these coastal Texas streams. So we go from arid to semi-humid, semi-arid to sort of humid catchments. And one thing just to note here, I know this is a lot of data, but this is by month, and then the concentration is on the y-axis. And again, this is the driest site. It goes in the order like this, down to the sort of the wettest site. And one thing to note here is that there's not a ton of pattern here, right? So DOC concentrations vary, number one, a lot by site, and they vary a ton by season, right? So lots of seasonal changes. And additionally, what they're color coded here is by wastewater treatment plant effluent, right? right? Where do we process a lot of water from our wastewater treatment plants, and a lot of times then that treated water is released into our streams and rivers. And so this is, I haven't teased apart exactly what's going on here yet. Again, this is sort of hot off the press data, but that's something we're kind of looking into if that drives any of the patterns that we see. Okay, so why do we have all that variability? Well, one reason that we have that variability is that every time it rains, rain or snow, we bring in organic carbon into the streams or rivers. And so this is work from my dissertation where I worked up in Wyoming and Utah and Colorado on the Green River and the Yampa River, where I was able to go out and sample these streams regularly every couple of weeks for an entire season. And these are snowmelt dominated streams. So this Q, that's stream discharge. That's the volume of water passing through one point at any point in time. The bigger the number, the more water, the bigger the river at the time. I then also measured organic carbon in the form of particulate organic carbon, those are the particles, and then also the dissolved organic carbon. And one thing just to note here, right, more stream discharge we have, the more organic carbon that we have, because that's bringing in from the landscape. Interesting note here, this is below Flaming Gorge, which is a large dam. You can see that it doesn't vary as much with changes in discharge. And that's because it's basically coming from a giant lake, right? So it's not necessarily seen reflecting the terrestrial landscape, organic matter coming in from the terrestrial landscape, but just rather what was in the lake. Also, all the previous sampling that I've showed you before in terms of dissolved organic carbon concentrations comes from going out and grabbing samples, right? Well, one thing that's happened, of course, in my time of being a scientist is that our sensor technology has just exploded. And the sensors are becoming more affordable and we can measure more things, which means we get more data. And so this is a sensor station I actually have out at the field station in Harmon Creek. I finally got it up and running this winter. And one of the sensors that I have a number of sensors out there: dissolved oxygen, conductivity, turbidity, CDOM. And so this is some of the data I'm showing you. Again, this is really early. I just downloaded these sensors the other day, but this is color dissolved organic matter, which is a proxy for dissolved organic carbon concentrations. So rather than going and grabbing samples when we can, we now collect data every 10 minutes. Okay, and so you can see here, we deployed these in February. These dark blue dots here, that actually is DOC concentrations where we went out, actually the students that work in my lab, go out and they collect samples and then they run it on the analyzer. So you can kind of see where these grab samples coincide with the peak of the CDOM sensor, right? But during that snow week, that really cold weather that we had actually snow melt and rain come in, and actually the sensor got buried. So that's why this data is missing here. But you can see lots of variation. This is probably another rain event and another small rain event here as well. So we definitely see color dissolved organic matter, or DOC, increase right here in Harmon Creek. Another sensor I have is also turbidity. So that looks again at the number of particles in the water. And so what I'm trying to then, I want to turn this eventually into organic carbon concentration. So again, similar to the graph I showed you before, this is collecting data every 10 minutes. This stream is really clear. I'm going to be really frank with you. Not a lot of blips in here, okay? This is during Snowmageddon. Right, the sensor was buried. This is probably not any good data, I'm guessing. I'm guessing that's not quite correct. But this is a little rain event, and then again, you see that reflected in our grab sample right after it rained. And then again, really low flow data, really low particulate organic carbon concentrations. Okay. So that's sort of examples of how we measure carbon coming from, or we can infer carbon coming off of the landscape and into the streams. But one thing, of course, I talked to you on and on, streams are not pipes, right? Streams actually do transform and produce carbon within their ecosystems as well. So this is some work by Carl Wagner. Carl was a graduate student from the University of Vienna that I worked with when I was a postdoc. And there, part of her dissertation work is she looked at primary producers, or the role of biofilms. Biofilms, you have biofilms on your teeth, we have biofilms on rocks, algae and fungi, primary producers in this case, but she wanted to look at the role of these primary producers and then terrestrial organic matter as well. And so she did everything in these little chambers, these little microcosms. And basically what I just want to show you here is that we were able to infer the amount of organic carbon that's being produced within these chambers and how it relates to light intensity. Well, if you remember anything from ecology, right, the more light we have, the more photosynthesis that we have. And so we actually probably have a saturating curve here. So the more light we have, more likely photosynthesis, and then more production of dissolved organic carbon. And this is what we call autochthonous organic carbon, that is produced within the stream from primary producers. Also, of course, rivers transform carbon a lot as well. And so one way that we can sort of get a proxy of how dissolved organic carbon might be processed within a stream is that we basically do these bioavailability experiments. Basically, we take water, we filter it, we put a little bit of whole stream water in there because that has the bacteria in it. We measure it on day 0, we stick it in a drawer for 28 days, and then we measure it again. And then we can quantify the amount of carbon that was lost in that 28-day period. And that's what we call this potential amount of carbon that's bioavailable to microbes. And we say it's potential because rivers are open systems. We've now put it in a closed system, okay? And one thing to note here, this is from the work that I'm doing in the coastal Texas streams here, from semi-arid to semi-humid streams. And one thing to note here is that the transformation of carbon, so this is the amount that's lost, can vary as low as 10% of the DOC is bioavailable to microbes, as even higher than over 30% on some time points there. But lots of variability across the ecosystems or across the stream ecosystems. And again, this is relatively new data. I haven't started to tease apart what's driving this pattern yet. And so what drives that? That's another question. What drives a lot of this internal transformation in production of carbon in streams and rivers? And that's a big thing, is what we call ecosystem metabolism. Ecosystem metabolism is an integrative estimate of how a stream ecosystem functions. And that's because it integrates both carbon and nutrient cycling. Ecosystem metabolism is comprised of both gross primary production, or GPP, which can be a carbon dioxide sink. It produces oxygen, uses carbon dioxide. And then it also comprises ecosystem respiration. And that, of course, can be a source of carbon dioxide, or rather also a source of a carbon dioxide source, and then a sink for oxygen, okay? And then when we combine these fluxes together, that's what we have as something called net ecosystem production, which can tell us if it's positive, that means it's autotrophic, could be a carbon dioxide sink, or it's heterotrophic, that is ER is greater than the GPP flux, so that could be a CO2 source. And so one way that we do that is we measure it with dissolved oxygen. Quite simply, we don't do it with carbon dioxide, but we rather do it with dissolved oxygen. And that's because we know on any given day within a stream, the change in dissolved oxygen over time throughout the day is going to be due to gross primary production, which is a positive flux, plus ER, which is a negative flux for oxygen because it's consuming oxygen. But then also this gas exchange, the very first thing I told you about when I started this lecture. We need to understand how gases move across the air to the water interface. And so we take data that looks like this. This is real data, right? This is a 1.5 years of oxygen concentrations for every 5 minutes, right? So we actually take that data, and then we can actually apply a model to it. And we actually model each time set of dissolved oxygen in order to estimate primary production, respiration, and sometimes K. I'll get into that, whether or not we actually estimate K with this model or actually measure K. And so we do this for a lot of days and across a lot of sites. And so the black dots, that is the data, right? So data every 5 minutes, and the red is the model. And so by trying to get the model to fit the data, we can then estimate the GPP and the ER, okay? And then this leaves us with this K, right? We can estimate K, that's oftentimes what we do. One way, there's lots of different ways to do it, but one way that we do it is we actually add gas to a stream. So this is an example of our setup when I worked in Austria. This is literally a propane tank, right? And then these are diffusers. And so we want to dissolve the gas as much as possible into the stream. And then we measure the loss of that propane gas or argon or whatever tracer gas we're using. We measure the loss as we go downstream. And then there we can infer how much gas is being lost as we move downstream. And then that's our K. And we do that a lot, right? We have to do it a lot through lots of sites. And for each site, we often develop a relationship between this K and stream discharge. Remember, stream discharge is the volume of water. When it storms, Q is bigger. When it's really low and dry, Q is really small. And Q is also, one reason why we do that is Q is a really kind of a good measurement of turbulence. And turbulence is what drives K. You can think about that. If you guys ever imagine being in a stream that has lots of rapids, lots of bubbles versus a really flat stream, which one do you think is going to have the higher K? It's going to be the one with the rapids, right? Because the gases are mixing up, the surface is being broken. And so we often have times to do this for each stream. So we set this model up, then we can feed that new estimated K from these models into our model. So that's sort of how I did it when I was a postdoc. Right after I finished my PhD, I moved to Austria and I lived in Vienna for a number of years. And I was able to do a lot of my research in this beautiful place called Lunds am See, right? We had a beautiful field station where I got to stay here in the sub-Alps of the Austrian Alps. And I had dissolved oxygen sensors deployed all over the catchment. So this is one big catchment, it's 254 square kilometers. This is upstream, and then this is downstream, okay? And these sites varied a lot. So these are some of these lower sort of sites in this valley, and then all the way up to our highest elevation sites up over here. So very open, and then some of these are more forested. And so then in the year and a half that I was collecting data, this is the type of data I generated. So I did this all by modeling dissolved oxygen. And so I'm not going to go through the nitty-picky details of this whole thing, but basically across this whole catchment, I was able to estimate gross primary production, ecosystem respiration. And then remember, the combination of those two fluxes is net ecosystem production. If NEP is above that dashed line, that means it's autotrophic, that is a sink for carbon dioxide. If it's below that line, those are what we call heterotrophic days. That's when ER exceeds GPP. So it's a source for CO2. And so basically using this really high frequency, lots and lots of data, we can conclude that in this sort of subalpine streams, in this catchment, we have a certain window of autotrophy. So these bars here, those are snowmelt years. And the yellow, the gold color happened to be really normal snowmelt year. And then the next following year, we had almost no snow that year. Actually, it was really bad skiing, right? And so what we noted is that in a normal year, these snowmelt years were our windows of autotrophy, right? So we actually had this sort of sink for CO2, whereas the following year, we didn't see that window when we had a decreased or a subdued snowmelt year. Of course, measuring K is tricky, right? And so this paper is published, and this was very open and honest when I published this paper. And so remember, I talked about all those K versus Q relationships that I had to develop. They're not always pretty, right? And I think I even said that in the paper. For instance, for one of our sites, if you guys know anything about stats, R squared, when you have a linear regression, it only explains 7% of your variability, even though you have a low p-value. Not so great, right? Also here, same thing, this site here, we could never find a model that really fit it well. We just didn't have the quite data. So it can be very tricky to measure K and also model it down the line. However, things are changing, right? Our capabilities and computing powers are getting better and better. And also we have a lot of really smart people that work on problems like this. And so right when I was publishing that paper from my postdoc, this program called Stream Metabolizer started to get really up and running. And this really advanced our capability in modeling approaches to model K along with gross primary production in ecosystem respiration. And so that's how we're doing it now. So that same, I'm funded by the National Science Foundation with my collaborators to study all these coastal Texas streams. And so that's what we're doing for these sites. So this is Connor Brown. Connor is my graduate student who's doing a great job working up all this data. He goes in the field every month. And these are what our sites look like, right? So sort of really flat. I've never worked in sites like this. I'm gonna be really frank with you. They're really flat. Sometimes even go hypoxic because there's so little gas exchange, and they get really hot because we're in Texas. And so we're using the stream metabolizer now to estimate GPP and ER across these sites. And we're just getting in sort of like a year of data. It's super exciting. So again, this is sort of hot off the press data. So this is looking at our 9 sites. I've showed you already DOC data and bioavailability data from this, but this is ecosystem respiration on the y-axis and gross primary production on the x-axis. And I like to plot these together. And the reason why that is this 1-to-1 line. That means that ER and GPP are equal to each other. That means that NEP is 0. If I'm above that line, GPP is greater than ER. That means it's autotrophic. If we're below that line, ER exceeds GPP. That means it's heterotrophic. And one way to just note here is that across all of our coastal Texas streams, we don't really see a lot of autotrophic days. You might, if you squint, like in some of these sites, say, oh, that's kind of autotrophic. It's very little. It's really encompassing about 0, which I was surprised. I thought maybe we'd see a little bit more action in the autotrophic realm. But one thing to note here is that you can see ER ranges quite a bit across our sites. We actually have very few data here because this river's gone dry. Can't measure metabolism when there's no water. And then we have some sites that have really high ER throughout most of the year as well. So lots of variability. But the key here is that when ER exceeds GPP, again, this is a potential source of CO2 to the atmosphere because of metabolism, right? Because of that respiration. All right, so just kind of wrapping up that first part, right? I sort of talked about where we get carbon from. DOC and POC can be delivered during precipitation events, but it can also be produced within the stream ecosystems as well. And then that eventually then gets respired by the microbes, which then contributes to ecosystem respiration or metabolism, okay? Also, of course, we can have CO2 coming in from groundwater, which then can hit the stream and then also evade as well. And then again, in-stream respiration of organic carbon as well. So the last part of this seminar I wanted to go over is, well, what drives the evasion of CO2? So we know now we likely have CO2 in the water. How do we get it from the water into the atmosphere, or what drives that? And again, this is going back to this gas exchange. Again, I was a reluctant lover of gas exchanges, and now I love it. So, but basically when we're calculating fluxes, we're interested in the concentration of whatever gas we're of interest in. I'm focusing on CO2 here, but we do this for nitrous oxide, methane, other greenhouse gases, oxygen, right? Basically, we're interested in the concentration in the air, and we're interested in the concentration in the water. And we want to know the difference of that. And then we can also use our gas exchange to figure out how much is actually driven either way, okay? For the most part, I'm not gonna say this is universally, because we do have windows where in some sites where there actually is more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than in the water. But as we're learning sort of, as scientists, we're learning that more and more freshwater ecosystems actually have a lot more CO2 relative to the atmosphere. So they're holding a lot more CO2. And also CO2 is really dissolves really easily, just so you know that. Like if you guys like beer or soda, right? You pop it open, it bubbles, and that's because we can dissolve a lot of that carbon dioxide into the water. And our freshwater streams and rivers, lakes have a lot of it. And so what we're really oftentimes interested then is, for the most part, we can measure concentrations pretty well, but the gas exchange, which I've probably already alluded to, can be difficult and tricky to measure. How we approach estimating gas exchange often will depend on what we're asking, right? And so this is a review paper that my PhD advisor and I wrote my first year here when I was at SAM, sort of trying to give a guide to people trying to figure this out, because this is always tricky. People always want to wave away gas exchange, and we just can't do it. And so again, we've sort of made this decision tree where it depends on our study objective. I already talked sort of about this end of things. If we want estimates for a particular stream, like such as I'm going to measure ecosystem metabolism through time, that's a number of different ways. I can do tracer gas releases, I can do floating domes, I can model it if the stream's flat enough. But if we're scaling to larger regions, right? So we're going to try to look across streams rather within one stream through time. We need to come up with empirical models based on hydraulics that we know that drive gas exchange. And so this is work by Pete Raymond. And then I also published a paper on gas exchange in mountain streams as well, which I'll briefly go over now. And so one thing that we know about streams is that slope, how steep the stream is, right? And then velocity, how fast that water is moving. That's going to dictate our turbulence and something that we call energy dissipation rate. Our energy dissipation rate, we can estimate this in streams. It's based on stream power unit of weight, which seems really wordy. But basically, it is the product of gravity. It's acceleration due to gravity, 9.81, right? The slope of the stream, so again, how steep it is, and then how fast the water is flowing, the velocity. And based on theory, we know that gas exchange, so here I'm denoting as K600, it's also just K. Based on theory, we know that gas exchange should increase with increasing energy dissipation rate. Gas exchange should decrease with stream order. Stream order is size. The bigger the number, the bigger the river. Like the Mississippi's like an order 12, right? Compared to our small headwater catchments here. And so because gas exchange is likely going to, energy dissipation rate will decrease with stream order, K600 should also therefore decrease with stream order. So larger streams should have less gas exchange. It makes sense. They tend to be calmer. They also tend to be deeper, right? Compared to small streams that have more surface area to volume to exchange gas. Oops. And so basically up until 2019, a lot of the models that we had to estimate gas exchange across a global scale, people have been working on this a lot, is really based on flat streams. And so this is looking at a distribution of the slope of streams on some of these original earlier models. Pete Raymond's a brilliant scientist. He's a professor at Yale that's done a lot of this upscaling work. But basically the model that they use, on average, it was a 0.3% slope. That's pretty flat. I would argue our Texas coastal streams were even flatter. We're on this end over here, okay? We're really flat. 3.6, we're starting to get pretty steep, but by far, most of our knowledge up until that point was based on flat streams. And that's important to note because when we're scaling, we're basically, they try to estimate the CO2 concentrations in water bodies across a large scale. They multiply that, the area that makes up, and then the K, right? That gas exchange. And then that's how they then get at this evasion or this flux of CO2. However, the world's not flat. It's kind of flat here in Texas, right? But we do have hills, but 20% of the Earth's surface is greater than a 4% slope. And I just want you to note why that's important here. That's our top end here, 3.6%, right? So they don't really count any of these steeper regions. Mountain regions are 25 to 39% of the continental surface. And often these regions are just not included or overlooked in terms of global scaling. However, these streams are faster, they're shallower, and they're narrower. So this is just scaling, looking at scaling relations. Again, this is the stream discharge, that volume of water passing through an area any time second. And then this is looking at log scale velocity, depth, and then also width. And then this is just simply comparing our flat low slope streams, that's in the yellow, and compared to alpine and subalpine. And so basically what you're just saying, for example, for velocity, when stream discharge increases, our velocity in our alpine streams are going to increase even at a faster rate than our flatter streams. Also, our streams are shallower as discharge gets bigger compared to our our flatter streams, and they're a lot narrower, even if with increasing Q compared to our larger streams. And everybody does ask, well, why is she going on and on about this, right? The key why this is important is that these are drivers in terms of energy dissipation rate and that turbulence is what drives gas exchange. And so a big part of this is, how do we scale from a river that looks like this, probably more what you see around here, around Huntsville, compared to a stream that looks like this. This is in Val Thorens in Switzerland, one of my favorite valleys to work in. And so this work was done when I was a research scientist at EPFL. This is Felicia Hammer. She was the bestest technician I've ever had. We hired her and she ran around mountain streams carrying argon tanks and measuring gas exchange all over the place. She did just an amazing job. Here we move from propane to argon, and where we can then measure the decline in argon through time. And that's how we estimate gas exchange. And we did this across 12 sites. And these 12 sites were located in 4 different catchments across Switzerland. So here's Switzerland. This is where I used to live on Lake Geneva, and then Lausanne. And then here are catchments here, Champrey, Val-en-Denant, Val-Ferret, and then also Val Thorens. So we took those numbers, we were able to estimate 56 estimates that's here of gas exchange in these high gradient streams. But then we said, well, these are really high. It's actually the highest published rates of gas exchange ever. But we can't just do that just with our site. We really need to compare it to all these other sites and how do these take place. So that's where we gathered data from our original data that built up our original models for scaling. And then we added in some other sites to bolster our steeper streams. And basically just looking at the range. So this is, again, a lot of our original data. This is slope up here, flatter streams. We now added a lot of steeper streams to that data set. Also the same with velocity. We also added streams that are faster, and we also added streams that were shallower, right? Again, compared to the green here. And these are all tracer gas experiments. And so that combines with 718 estimates of gas exchange. And so then what we did with this is that we took this data and we decided we had to come up with a model, right? How can we explain gas exchange? And so what we found is that is this broken stick model. And so what we found is that 78% of the variation in gas exchange could be explained by this energy dissipation rate. Remember, that's a product of gravity, slope, and velocity. But what was interesting about it, it wasn't just a linear relationship or anything like that. In fact, we had to kind of fit this two-step model into it. And so 35 meters per day is sort of a magic number, we think, here, where anything above that is what we call bubble mediated gas exchange. That means that the bubbles are really dominating the gas exchange. And so as the energy dissipation rate increases, it accelerates. Our gas exchange is going to accelerate. Anything below that number is what we call turbulent diffusive exchange, right? So it's a little bit more quieter type of exchange. And anything below that, it's going to attenuate with energy dissipation rate. So what we found is that there's this two really distinct regimes in terms of quantifying gas exchange. This is work that I published in Nature Geoscience. We then took those numbers, or I didn't take these numbers. Well, I was part of the people that took these numbers. Osa Horgby, again, she's a graduate student I worked with in Switzerland. She did a lovely job, and colleagues. And she actually then was able to take our new model of gas exchange for mountain streams and then try to include them in these gas fluxes and these CO2 fluxes. And so that was a lot of work, because part of it is that also these smaller streams in mountain regions are just ignored. So again, she looked at elevation, gas exchange based on our model from Nature Geoscience, and then looking at also the delta CO2, so the difference in the air and the water concentration. And then she was able to calculate this flux of CO2. Red is really high, right? A couple of these are sink sites. This is actually the Tibetan Plateau, which happens to be a sink, and that's because the CO2 concentrations in the water were really low. And basically what her take home of this is that number one, these high fluxes of carbon dioxide evasion from alpine streams is definitely driven by K, that high gas exchange that nobody ever wants to model, and that CO2 evasion from mountain streams equals or exceeds those from boreal streams, which is amazing, because the more net primary production that you have in terrestrial ecosystems, the more CO2 we assume that we're going to have, and the more efflux we assume that we're going to have. These mountain streams don't have a lot of net primary production in terrestrial ecosystems. And so we go back to where we started off, right? How does this infer to sort of the bigger picture? Is that when we do include these high gradient streams, we're just going to keep upping these estimates of CO2 evasion. And we were able to do that because we nailed down gas exchange, and also we were able to quantify mountain streams. And so what I'm doing now that I'm here in Texas is that I'm kind of continuing to do this sort of similar work in a bit, but really focusing on the subtropical and tropical streams that we have here. So I'm working here in Texas, and then I'm also starting to do work in Mexico as well. And so we'll see what goes there, because we also still know very little about subtropical and tropical streams as well. So I hope I think I might have gone a little bit over, but I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
All right, well. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, okay, comment. Well, I suppose not. Well, most of our members do have other stuff at 6, but
yeah,
don't sweat it. I was keeping track of time. I was like, oh, well, we're a little over. It's all good. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Olsa, for presenting your research to us. I enjoyed it, and frankly, it was a little confusing just how it was, and like with all the the math models, honestly, I still struggled with that in ecology. So catching up on that really reminded me of how much I struggled in ecology.
Well, I definitely didn't want to belabor the models. I don't think anybody, mostly it's just like this is how we have to get at this sort of modeling approach. So.
But yeah, it's super interesting stuff, and it's really a lot to look forward to, not only with just ecology, but just, well, I guess it is mainly ecology, but like a whole lot of other stuff, especially with I know with Dr. Randall, we're doing niche modeling for pests for big cash crops, and then eventually we'll move on to mistletoe.
Yeah.
So it's just all these models are they're ridiculously complex, and you typically end up with a nice pretty picture at the end of it, hopefully.
Well, I guess one thing when I started learning how to model, I also was a little like, oh gosh, but I knew I wasn't going to get a dissertation unless I learned how to model, because I just didn't have the data that could, but you just break it down step by step. And then also when your models don't work, sometimes that's the most fun because we make models based on how we think the world works, right? And so when they don't match, that's kind of tells us something too, right? Absolutely, like, hey, this isn't exactly how we think it works. So where are we wrong, you know? And so, but also just I think the way that in science that we're going with technology, we just collecting so much data. Not just in ecology, but other fields. I mean, especially what the work that Dr. Randall does, you know, that's it's just an enormous amount of data. So learning how to process that and handle that is definitely a skill set that will be needed. So I know at least in ecology, a lot of times we look more and more for people with a good math background. I don't have a good math background. I kind of fumbled my way through some of the modeling, but yeah, it can be fun. So yeah.
Well, if anyone doesn't have any questions, we can go ahead and call it a meeting. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Elseth, for presenting. I really
Thanks for
enjoyed
inviting me, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank
But-
you.
Thank you.
And